Greetings and welcome to the very first episode of KurtApproved. My name's Kurt Wilson. Some people would probably think it's pretty bold or arrogant to name a podcast something like KurtApproved. And as we go down this avenue, I'll explain how that name and saying came about. So just a little introduction to me. Just a gentleman that's from the Midwest who is just probably your average guy that grew up in the 70s and came into their own as far as having to get out and get a job and become an adult in the late 80s and early 90s. I don't really look upon myself as anything more than a guy that has always just done whatever's been needed to survive, to make a living, to attempt to be the best person, the best son, best coworker, best friend to people. So to get a little introduction to who I am, my life has, I guess, probably not really been what the average person has experienced, so maybe that's a contradiction in terms, because of me being born an identical twin, which isn't, like in the 70s, wasn't really that common of a thing per se. Over time, statistically, the numbers have increased on the number of twins being born for different factors and such, but most twins are fraternal rather than identical, which means to some, me and my brother look the same, and we're confused for the longest time growing up. It's just something that I've always dealt with and never really have experienced anything outside of that. Take the good or the bad with that. Imagine your whole life being compared to somebody that looks just like you. It does glorify or modify or expose your shortcomings. And I'm sure he has had experiences, but I've never felt that I excelled in the areas that he has. Definitely experienced the challenges of trying to match his level of experiences to excel. In areas that I felt that he probably things just came easy to, were areas that I struggled with. School was never something that was real easy for me to do, and where to him it seemed like he excelled at. But it just was the norm. I never really put a whole lot of thought into a whole lot of that. It just was life, and him being the nearest person to compare the areas of my, I guess for a lack of a better terms, the areas that I was deficient in. He was the one that I was competing with every day, every second. It was somebody I had to compete against. It wasn't something that was blatantly put out there, and it wasn't the environment that I was raised in. It just happened naturally. You if you have somebody that you're pretty much the same age with, doing the same things with, and you live under the same roof, there are going to be comparisons drawn, and maybe those comparisons are drawn internally, but that was the life that I've lived. It wasn't much until much later in life where our career paths took different paths, and I found the areas that I excelled in, and that's what I did. And he found the areas that he excelled in, and he did. It's just, I'm going to say probably a different life than most are used to. Most kids going through school may compare themselves academically in the classroom to their nearest person that they earn the same marks And then in the sports field, where the same areas where that person excels or decels in. That's the competitive side of sports. It just naturally happens, and you're ranked. But when you have a brother that looks identical to you, those comparisons get kind of modified, kind of like under a microscope, I would guess. I'm not saying that is a terrible thing. I never ever felt it was unequal, and it wasn't truly a competition, because most of the time in that aspect we were pretty equal. It gave me somebody every day to go outside and like during summers to play catch with, baseball, kick the soccer ball around, throw the football around, whatever. I had a built-in playmate all the time that kind of showed the same interests and was at the same pace of you. It wasn't too out of the ordinary. So of a kid that grew up, the 70s, the outside world was our lives. That's kind of what we did. Came from a family with, I would say, your typical middle class. Didn't have all that extra stuff. Had friends that had more stuff than we had, but we just never really. I never realized it. I guess I shouldn't really speak for anybody else. It just was a good time to be growing up. And then 80s, was middle school and high school, and then they graduated in first year of 1990. That was the 90s were the formative years of me figuring out what I was going to do for a career. It took me into a path where I spent the 90s either in a tow truck or in a garage or a body shop. I spent the early 90s in a body shop that had a tow truck that allowed me to get the best of both the worlds. There was great satisfaction in working in the body shop and taking a car that was wrecked to a point to where, when it left, it was as good as new, or didn't, if anything, look better than when it came off the showroom floor. It allowed me to operate a tow truck, and I thought I was pretty proficient in that. And then I got my first job working for a company that's towing was their business. And that's all the business was based on. I mean, did they do some repair work? Yes, but there was nothing like working in the body shop. And at the towing company, that's where I got the majority of my foundation and education for the towing world. I was very fortunate enough to work for a company where the owner had invested in training for himself, or maybe took his key guy, and then, like most companies, they would train you underneath of them, and from there, that foundation was built for the workers. Just probably not too out of the ordinary what transpires today. You invest in your key guy, and their responsibility is to educate the people below them. I worked with some very quality operators who took the time to educate the new guy, the young guy. Considering when I hired in, I was 20 years old, and treated with the utmost respect, and I looked to be a long-term employee, or maybe as they looked at it, an investment, somebody that was willing to take the time to learn, and really admit when something didn't go right, or there was a mistake, maybe something got damaged, all of that learning curve. It was a good environment to be in. It was a small business, family owned. The owner's son was coming into his own, got his license at the time. So was there friction and such? Yeah, just any type of friction that you would have with a father-son. And in that family business, it wasn't anything that I hadn't experienced at the body shop. That was kind of a family business. It was two guys that were a partnership. So there was those events that you just dealt with, and that's just the environment that I was used to. It wasn't corporate America by no means. And I wouldn't trade any of those experiences for anything. During that time, one of the big businesses in the area went out on strike, labor dispute. Business came to a not really a crawl, but things slowed down. And being the last guy in, I wasn't really needed when business slowed. So ended up finding another job in a similar field as far as mechanics, and worked on tractors for a bit, the implement side. Worked for a great guy there. Had some great coworkers, and just over time found that wasn't exactly the best fit for me, with not having that background on the farm side. We did commercial accounts with golf courses and sold commercial mowers and such and all of that. It just was an area that really wasn't in my wheelhouse at best. So ended up having an opportunity to land a job working in a dealership on the automotive side, and that was a good fit. But the one thing that was consistent during all of the time, either at the body shop, the tow yard, the implement dealer, and the dealership, was that my work ethic followed the guidelines set place. If there was a repair manual, I got the repair manual out and followed every step. If something needed to be torqued to spec, torque wrench came out. Even if it was something that most guys would just go by feel. And I'm sure over time, when you do something long enough, you do get the feel. And you know what the operating range is, or you get something torqued down. And it's probably pretty close, but I was the guy that had to have the torque specs, or the procedure that this torque sequence was followed. It wasn't just it's good and move on. So that was something that I carried from job to job. And at the dealership, I would follow those procedures, and not saying right or wrong or different. I worked with some guys that were able to rely on, I would say, maybe gut instinct, and it worked for them. I just always wanted to make sure that everything was done to task. The nice thing about working at the dealership, they also had tow trucks, which afforded me the opportunity at times to step up and run a tow truck when the other guy needed some time off, or was unavailable, or they were busy, and so I found that the towing turned into a passion. It was something that I was good at. It was something that was pretty easy, problem solving, and there was a discipline to be followed that got kind of presented to me at the tow company. The two brothers and the owner and the other guys kind of showed, there was disciplines you followed. Of course, there was books out there. Bill Jackson, We Are the Professionals, were kind of the Bible of the industry at the time, and was lucky enough to be able to read his first two books while I was there. It was guarded material. You kind of had to fight for him to get access to him, and anytime there was free time, that there was nothing else going on, I took the time to read those books, or if I was lucky enough to bring them home and study them. And of course, you had trade magazines, American Towman and Tow Times, that had stuff in it, and the thirst for knowledge was always there. Was always trying to better myself and knowing the trends or what was going out there. It was long before this thing we call the internet. Cell phones were just a thing that were getting started to come out, and we're talking bag phone. Pagers were pretty common, but whenever you got paid, you had to find a payphone. And if you were out working a job, you really didn't have the opportunity to phone a friend or look it up. So you had to be prepared for stuff. And the thirst for that knowledge is kind of where that came from. There was nothing worse than going out and having something that you couldn't figure out, maybe that get defeated, or having to leave the scene to find a payphone to phone in to talk to somebody. So was a different environment. So, as time clicked away at the dealership, eventually the gentleman that ran the tow truck ended up leaving. It opened the door for me to take over the towing side of the dealership. So, ended up being that, the one guy that had the truck 7 days a week, 24/7, had a guy that would help out, from time to time. But most of the time it was just me running the calls, and along the way that convinced the owner to send me to the first official any type of organized training that I ever attended, and that was a class that was presented by Wreckmaster back in '97. Went to the class to really understand towing procedures. That was an area cars were changing I was deficient in, and I didn't really know anything about the class, and went to a class and came back from it, and it allowed me to go back to the other tow company and have conversations with the guys there, and kind of say, hey, I really understand this stuff now, the stuff that you were teaching me. I'm just curious, why didn't you just explain it more in detail? And they were like, guess we just never really thought of it. We just kind of needed you to understand what you needed to do, not why you were doing it. So that was the process and the steps that went, and spent several years doing that. But it was all light duty work, towing cars and trucks, rollback and carrier stuff, and I was pretty content and happy with that. And then an opportunity to go back to the tow company arose. One of the brothers, sat me down and we talked about it, and the push was to get into the heavy duty side, and I guess I kind of skipped over it, but the experience at that tow company, within the first month, I was out on semi-wrecks and seeing the big trucks work, but it was more of like a hand, or a swamper, as some guys call them, be told what to do and not running any levers, but are being labored to unload or put air cushions in place, and you talk about having got eyes wide open, using air cushions to upright something that's loaded and such. It just was a totally different experience, and man, that was just too cool. And that was probably one of the things that, when it came time to have to find a different job, that's the area that was kind of missing. So when I was told I could come back and actually, go get my CDL so I could operate that equipment, and that, the opportunity was there, I kind of leapt at it, took that leap, and the training began between the two brothers, and the three of us became a pretty solid team, and I was towing, doing the heavy duty and still doing some light duty stuff, and we were doing recovery work, and eventually got to the point to where, I was afforded the opportunity to operate the crown jewel of recovery trucks at their place, Home 1701. Today most guys would kind of chuckle at that, but it was the equivalent of being handed the keys to a rotator, I would say, and to run the what was considered, that one elitist truck that nobody got to drive. That was the day you graduated, and worked there for quite a while crafting the skill. I mean, it got to the point to where the three of us could go out and do recovery work and not have to say a word to anybody. We just knew what the other one was going to do, and it got done. Everybody had the areas that they did, and it was great. And then came the opportunity to change professions altogether. Really wasn't looking for a job or career change or even an industry change. And it's just all by chance happened. Took a vacation, probably the first vacation in my adulthood in a long time. My father and brothers convinced me to go to Bristol, Tennessee to watch a NASCAR race under the lights. During the trip, it was my dad, my brother, the gentleman that was still working at the dealership that I had worked at. And we went and had a great time. And just happened by chance on the trip home, the gentleman from the dealership asked if I had heard what the owner of the hockey team, which happened to be the gentleman that owned the dealership, the minor league hockey team, the local team, had bought for the team. And I said, no, I hadn't really been paying a lot of attention to the sports world. I've been kind of consumed in the towing world. And he explained to me that the hockey team had purchased this custom bus and said that it was a Kenworth. And I kind of chuckled and said, you don't know anything about buses. Kenworth doesn't make a bus. And he explained to me that it was a custom bus that they take and put a box on the back end of it and turn it into a sleeper. And the team travels by that going down the road. And that's how they're going to travel next year. And I know I said it was, man, it'd be kind of cool to drive that. Didn't really think a whole lot of it. And he went back and told the ownership that I was interested in driving a bus, which was at the time the furthest thing from the truth. So my brother was still working at the dealership. He got harassed, and eventually I went over and had a conversation with the owner of the dealership and the owner of the hockey team, and he set an interview up. I went and had an interview. A couple interviews later, I agreed to give it a chance with the agreement that it was just a short-term deal, and if it didn't work out, I was going to go back to towing, and they'd have to find a bus driver. And this would have been the early 2000s, like 2001 era. And you talk about a guy walking into a job with no really understanding of what had been transpiring in the hockey world in the area, since I hadn't gone to a game since the late 80s, early 90s. So first trip was down to St. Louis to a Blues game with the ownership and the coaching staff, and met the coach and had no idea who he was. I'm sure probably till this day he questions the guy that asked him who he was and didn't understand that he had just helped the team win a championship the year before. He was the MVP, all of who he was. But I think that worked out into my favor, because I wasn't a fan. I was there to do a job. Again, I followed the strict discipline. I mean, I wasn't there to be a fan. I was there to do a job. It was my job to get the team to and from their games, help out at the home games whenever possible, just stay out of the way. They do their job, I do mine. And any hesitation that I had kind of melted away within that first road trip, where the team just was so welcoming. The fear that I had was that these guys were going to be prima donnas and demanding and treat me truly as a bus driver. But at the end of the day, it was more than that. It was a family environment, a brotherhood, and everybody kind of looked out for one another. And you have to have that when you're dealing with teams. Everybody's there to help one another. And that first season and that first group of guys will always be, something special. Hopefully in time, as this thing progresses, and if there's an interest, I have no idea if this is just me talking to myself, but I'd like to be able to get some of those guys on here to just talk about not just those days, but what their life was, bringing them up to that, what it was like after. Because there truly is a bunch of special guys that were part of that. So, from 2001 up to 2008, I was heavily involved in sports. I left the team to pursue a different job with one of the guys that had come through Peoria as a player who started a company that just seemed like an amazing opportunity, and spent a year pursuing that. And when that just didn't really seem to be going in the direction I believed that it needed to go, we parted ways. And during that time, a couple things were going on. There was this TV show that came out about towing, and was seeing all the changes that had happened since I got away, and it kind of made me miss doing that stuff. So in '08, I went back and took a week-long course through Recmaster. Went up to Chicago, took the ringleader class, and started looking for a job to get back in the tow and recovery world. And those two events led me to meeting two gentlemen that I was familiar with the name of the company, but had never had any dealings with. Had never met them. And between the two of them, they offered me a job to come in and manage one of their locations, real close to where I was residing. Wasn't really sure that what he was offering was what I wanted to do, because it was kind of light duty work and I wanted to do heavy duty, but I took the opportunity and started building a team of guys and creating a culture, and moved forward and built the base of the business up. And that's kind of, it was there where this whole KurtApproved saying was born. I wasn't really familiar with it. But, when you go to tow a car, there's certain things you're required to do. And every time you tow a car, that's what you do. And if a manufacturer tells you this is how it's done and not to do it outside of that, that's how it was done. And it kind of became this running joke out of the other location when guys were doing stuff that didn't follow those guidelines or do everything. It was this joke. Hey, is that KurtApproved? And it was a joke. And, and slowly over time I started hearing rumblings about, this KurtApproved thing. And eventually it came out, and I would ask about it, and guys were kind of hesitant to talk about it, and eventually, they were more comfortable to talk about it, and they figured I'd be upset over it. And at the end of the day, I really wasn't, because if somebody was talking about it being KurtApproved, then they kind of knew where the line was, and if they chose not to toe the line, then they knew the risk they were taking. So it was an eye-opening experience for them, and maybe they didn't understand that they were making a conscious decision, knowing maybe they weren't doing something correct, but they chose not to. It's through day-to-day events, most people do make that conscious decision if they're going to follow something and do everything the right way. And I'm not saying by no means are they doing it wrong. I'm not saying that. I mean, it's that conscious decision because, I consciously make the decision sometimes when I'm driving to exceed the speed limit. So that's towing over the line. But I've made that conscious decision and understand the risk that comes with that. The risk of being pulled over or involved in an accident or whatever. We make these conscious decisions day in and day out. And some people over time, it stops being a conscious decision and it just becomes the norm. I've said the word discipline several times, and we all have our disciplines, and we all know where the disciplines are. It's up to us to choose to follow them and how much of them we follow and how much we don't. But when we step outside that discipline, that kind of removes the freedom we have to operate within it. And that's me stealing some stuff from Jocko Willink. Over time, the more of these I do, I'm sure Jocko's name's going to come up. I'm hoping to talk about, the influencers. We talk about influencers today due to social media. Who do you follow? Who has influence over you? We all do. Before the social media, who influenced us? I mean, you can go back to TV, you had people on TV. You could talk about Sunday morning, or the people that even the people on like Home Shopping Network, the people that were presenting that stuff, are the infomercials. Billy Mays. But yet there's more. We as a society do allow people to have influence over us. Some are more easy influenced and some are more cynical. And you always got to question, why are those people cynical? Did they have a bad experience, or do their discipline not allow them to think outside of that box? What causes all of this stuff? At the end of the day, I don't really have a platform that I'm going to present from on this. This is me having fun. I felt the first episode needed some explanation on kind of who I was, where I was coming from, explanation of the name. I've thrown around a bunch of other names, talked to different people. I've had people tell me that choosing to call this KurtApproved limits the audience. I agree that it does. Kurt's podcast, I could have called it that. It's just something simple. I guess over time, at times, it's hard to be extremely creative to get your point across in a way that draws people in. Maybe not. The purpose of this really is just for me to have fun. I think there's a lot of people out there that are just the average Joe who have a story to tell. I think also besides that, like Jocko Willink, his podcast is based on people who write books, that he covers the books, but at the same time generally has those people on. And there's several books that I'm going to want to spend an episode or two on to cover, that I think they're worth talking about. But man, I know a lot of people who are pretty cool, and their stories need to be told. Are they going to be like super famous people? No, they're going to be these average people that if you sat down and talked to them, I'm interested in their stories, and it's just like talking to somebody that's famous. So at the end of the day, what makes somebody famous is that they were at the right place at the right time. We're there putting in the effort and the time and just perfecting their craft to be able to be on the news, or present the news or sports, be that athlete, or their craft as an actor or actress. But the same effort those people put in that craft, there's people putting that effort in their craft. The gentleman that built up that business from nothing, the athlete that put in all those hours of practicing, the getting up early to go skate or to go to the gym, but along the way, there's those little encounters here or there that just make them relatable to us, and that's kind of where I'd like to see this go. I don't know how long these podcasts are going to be. I listen to some that are 2.5 hours, and then like a micro, 15, 18 minutes. I think it's just going to depend on the subject matter and such. If there's some opportunity to teach, I guess, and have a lesson come across, then that'll work too. The format's fluid, is what I'm just trying to say. At the end of the day, I guess we'll have to see if anybody's interested in listening to what I have to say. But at the other point, this may just turn into be therapy for me, and I may just keep doing it and kicking them out there. And if somebody listens, that's great. If not, I'm fine with that as well. There's hasn't been a number put out there for me to keep doing this or not. I think there's value in it. I think if me sitting down with people to have conversation with them, especially if it's a father-son or a mom and a dad with their kids, to where you sit down and have conversations, and the kids learn something that they never knew that the parents did to get them to this point, or that the parents had no idea the kids knew this was going on, or they did this at the time to make this successful. I think that's pretty cool. We get really busy living our lives, and I think at times we kind of miss out on the communication part, and that's the tough part. It's just, I think there are times we just need to talk. It's just amazing. I've been very lucky. I've traveled and hit most of the states. Been up in Canada, and when you start talking to people, everybody's lives are kind of on the same trajectory. It's just the encounters sometimes are a little different. I mean, sometimes it's just hard for me to even fathom of some of the locker rooms that I've been lucky enough to stand in, or to know, their guys are playing in the NHL that I can call a friend. That's just crazy. Or at the same point, I know guys all across North America, and I guess you could probably say around the world, that operate towing and recovery equipment that I'm lucky enough to call friends, And I think there are times where we just need to take the time to sit back and just say, this life, I've been pretty lucky. Have there been moments where it's been terrible and tragedy? Yes. Oh, there's no doubt about that. Anybody who's lived for any length of time has experienced tragedy. And it's those moments where we stand in that darkness, where we kind of step back and maybe take a measure of the person we are, but it's those moments where we get to stand in the light, really make us take that in and understand just how bright that light is. I am not going to use this platform to preach. That's not the intent here. It's just to communicate. Hopefully figure out some way to have some pretty cool guests on here. That's the plan. Time can be limited. I have a pretty busy schedule, so without really knowing what that's going to look like, I don't know what the commitment is. The plan is kind of get a bunch of these put together, then release them so that if I'm busy, there's still some type of regular, update of these things going out. I don't know if releasing one a week is practical, or if it's going to be like one a month. I would like to do one a week. That's quite the commitment on my part, but it's just going to depend on what it looks like. To do something, I think, proper, you got to put the effort in. There's going to be some research time and put this together. And then just hope to find the right guest and people on here that makes doing these things so easy. Sit back and let them talk, and then all I got to do is kind of steer the conversation and make sure that it just stays on point. That's kind of the goal. By no means am I a professional interviewer, but I think when you have conversations, you just kind of know where they need to go, and you just find out what people want to talk about. I think that pretty much covers the basis of the thought process that's going on here. As time affords and the equipment affords moving forward, I think the door opens to get some pretty cool people on here and, update the equipment, make the thing sound nice and all of that. Again, I don't know the first thing about doing this, so I'm just sitting here having a conversation with myself. I just kind of wanted to explain who I was and the thought process behind this. And as time moves forward, maybe we'll see, what needs to be done to improve. I guess at some point, video podcasts are a thing. I don't have the technology to really do that right now. I'm sure I could piece something together, but I'm going for the pretty simple mode, microphone plugged into a computer and recording the podcast that way, So as time moves on and, the infrastructure improves, that's going to open the door and afford me to do better quality stuff. And that's just where I'm at this moment. Like I said, I'm not going to stand here and say that I'm this person that's more than I am. I'm just this average guy that likes to talk at times, at other times is kind of quiet. So I don't claim to know a whole lot about one thing, but a whole lot of little stuff about a wide variety of different subjects. As they say, just enough to be dangerous at times. But I do have the ability to do my research and on the areas and topics that I know very little about, to find the person that does and get them to talk about it, So I've got a list of people I definitely have to figure out some way to be able to sit down and have conversations with, and just see where that goes. Like I said, this isn't going to be strictly on towing. It's not going to be on sports. It's not going to be on this. It's going to be whatever person that I find interesting to have a conversation with, and where that conversation goes. And I hope at the end of the day that it's enjoyable and people walk away and see the value in this. So this is actually longer than what I thought. I figured at best I'd end up with like 15 minutes worth of stuff for the first one, and I'm clicking up on the 45-minute mark. So with that being said, I'm going to wrap this one up. We'll see where the next one goes. And just to everybody that took the time to listen to this, just be safe out there. And try to follow the discipline of the industry that you're in. Be safe. Take care. I'll be back at another date. Signing off.